old days when the internet was emerging, and we had all this hope for their ability to democratize information in terms of offering accurate, fair reporting within local communities, especially perhaps, and connecting us globally as well. Moreover, the promise of social media for democracy, and some of the promise of democratizing information has happened. It's provided outlets for information and truths to surface and be shared by populations and individuals who have historically been silenced, forbidden access, or written out of historical narratives and from mainstream journalism. It's provided powerful platforms for the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ movements, the Arab Spring, etc. But the promise of harnessing the journalistic and democratizing power of social media for positive social change has fallen short in many ways, especially, as we'll hear from our panelists, in terms of offering accurate, fair reporting within local communities. And moreover, the promise of social media for democracy feels like it's slipping away as we increasingly find ourselves questioning reality, or to borrow from Simon Arl, at the end of reality. So in this panel today, we'll hear about some of the challenges from the experts that study and deal with these in practice, and we'll hear about some hopeful and promising local grassroots initiatives that might provide some inspiring pathways forward through these otherwise perilous waters. Just a quick note on format. If we manage our time correctly, I'll hope to pose a follow-up question to each of the speakers after they speak, and then we'll hold general questions at the end. So first, I would like to invite Dr. Joan Donovan. You all have full bios with you, but Joan is the research director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. Dr. Donovan leads the field in examining internet and technology studies, online extremism, media manipulation, and disinformation campaigns. Please join me in thanking. Welcome, Joan.
Thanks. I'm going to let that clapping sink in so that I get that positive vibes going for this morning. Sorry I was late. I was dealing with some car trouble. So I have a couple of ideas that I just want to put on the table. I feel like this is a really good format to introduce maybe potentially provocative ideas, to challenge already well-worn notions about how we're going to save journalism in an era of digital media. And I think, one of the things that I've been learning through the work I do at Shorenstein and our executive education program for news leaders is, yes, it's the business model, not just of platform companies, but also of legacy newsrooms. So one of the things that me and my colleagues, Brandy Collins-Dexter, Rob Ferris, and Emily Dreyfus have been looking at is precisely the differences between red, blue, center, middle, left, right, extreme right media ecosystems. What are these animals? Do they look the same? Are they of the same genre? Are they of the same species? And some of the work that we're doing is pointing to, well, no. And so Rob's work in the book Network Propaganda with Yochai Benkler really shows very clearly that the right-wing media ecosystem has a different business model than center and left. So if you imagine center and left have broadcast through cable, newspapers, subscription systems, paywalls everywhere you go, very difficult to get that content. On the right, even in their cable news and their AM radio divisions and their online news associations and groups and outlets, everything is free. And it's really well circulated, really well crafted in terms of metadata to make sure that when you go on YouTube and you're looking up an event or something that's breaking, you are likely to get at least a Fox News link in the top few responses. So what do we know about what people are looking for online? Well, we know that when people are looking for something, they are most vulnerable to media manipulation, propaganda, disinformation. Because when you search for something, you know what you don't know, right? And that leaves you open to being persuaded that the UFOs that we've been seeing recently in the sky could be alien life forms, they could be Russia, they could be China, they could be a weather balloon, right? And so we have to think more holistically about this media ecosystem, the business models that different news organizations are utilizing, as well as how do people encounter information on the web, and what would it mean to change that encounter. Some of the things that we've worked on, Gabby Lim is leading up project on the true costs of misinformation. That is, who are the custodians and everyone else that has to clean up the mess of misinformation at scale? Once 80,000 people have seen some kind of misinformation, or 80 million, more is different. And it requires different kinds of debunking, different kinds of civil society responses as the scale gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Who pays for that? Essentially civil society organizations. For every article that's written about debunking election misinformation, newsrooms are trading off not writing an article perhaps about climate change or something else that is a slower beat. So the trade-offs, the true costs of misinformation at scale are paid by civil society, they're paid by election officials, public health officials, anyone that has to jump in and correct the record. And of course, with social media being designed the way it is, those corrections are very difficult to discover in search, and often are not attached to the misinformation that was previously shown. So one of the avenues that we've been exploring is, well, what would it be like, and this is cribbing from some of Victor's work, what would it be like to introduce a concept like talk to the social media ecosystem. So TALK stands for timely, accurate, local knowledge. And we call it knowledge instead of information because knowledge has a method. It usually requires some kind of resources to produce. It's from a verifiable source. So if we were to mandate in some way, either within corporate policy or within a regulatory system, like we do with radio broadcast, that the entity serving up information has to include some public interest content in their feed, it might prevent people from searching for UFO because they will have seen in their feed a piece of news from NPR that says this is the latest update on UFOs in the sky presently over the US. It'll prevent people from getting into the muck and the mire of search and recommendation systems. And so what would it look like to have that kind of talk regularly appear in news feeds and timelines, especially as we're looking to combat this major new problem of misinformation at scale. I'm not saying misinformation's new. Like, I don't want to rehash any debates from 2016 about the quantity of fake news or what have you. But I do think that it's wicked important, because we're in Boston, right? It's wicked important to take this idea of talk, or take what we think about social media, start moving away from these like cowboy cops of the internet monitoring systems. We don't want to turn every research organization into a content moderation team. That's not what we're here for in academia. Our job is not to fix the platforms. Our job is to think more holistically and more grounded about what the public really needs. And then our job is to advocate for that. And I might be losing my job because of that, but word to the wise. But I do think it's really important that my job isn't to save Facebook, right? My job isn't to come out here and tell you how to fix Twitter. My job is to say there's something fundamentally broken about the way people access information online, and we need to address it at the systems level, at the level of scale. And one of the ways to do that is to mirror laws and policies that have been successful in the past at distributing public interest content. And my hope is if we do that, we can get the web we want. We can get a public interest internet. If we don't do that, it's more of this plus probably fascism, which is not democracy. Some of you may have heard. Others, though, could be convinced that fascism is a better system. And unfortunately, with the work that I do on extremism, there seem to be quite a few people convinced that authoritarianism and fascism is the way out of the problems of today. Because what they're most scared of is a representative, multiracial democracy where people who do not look like them have voting rights, are called citizens. And at the end of my book, Meme Wars, we argue that the main meme that is being fought over in this very moment is what it means to be American. Who counts, who doesn't, who's had to fight for inclusion, who's had to fight for their voting rights, who's had to fight for their property rights, who's had to fight for access to jobs and healthcare. And routinely, as we think about democracy, we have to think more than just, okay, democracy is about securing the nation from foreign threats. We also have to think about what is the infrastructure that undergirds and supports an informed citizenry. And currently, right now, that's the internet. And so we need to move into this digital age. We need to bring the business models of legacy media organizations into this world, into the digital age, where they start to think about, yes, knowledge is expensive, news is expensive to produce, but are there other ways we can fund it? Are there other ways we could ensure people see it? And how do we get there using our best tools, which include regulation, international alliances between civil society organizations, technologists that are willing to take risks within corporations to show what's really happening. So one of the other projects, and this is where I'll end, the last thing I'm doing with LaTanya Sweeney before I leave Harvard, is to publish all of the Haugen papers and make them public so that journalists across the world and researchers across the world can look at them and understand what Facebook knew and what they knew was broken about their technologies, how they knew that their technologies were aiding in incitement at the Capitol, how they knew that their technologies were harming teenage girls, and what they did, which was nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. I'd just like to pose a quick follow-up question, if I could. You talked a lot about regulation and legislation. So, as many of you might know, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, legislation that was...
Don't say it too loud,
Sorry.
or the legal scholars will run like jackals.
So ironically, originally implemented to protect the pornography industry at the urging of powerful lobbyists, it actually protects social media platforms from legal actions against them because it treats them as platforms instead of publishers. So essentially, to borrow from Patriot Act's Hassan Minhaj, allows them to organize the news like magazines on a newsstand, here including the ability to moderate the content as they see fit without being held legally responsible for the content that's actually published. It's a sharp juxtaposition, as all of you know, as journalists, that you have to adhere to. So SCOTUS is now reconsidering these protections for platforms under Section 230 in two very high-profile cases against YouTube and Google to be decided this summer. Mm-hmm. What might we expect, and how do you think that's going to change the outcomes for these tendencies towards extremism and social divisions that you mentioned?
I mean, a very U.S.-centric point of view on this is that whatever happens, YouTube and Google will create a kind of clause that says if you upload content that violates the terms of service, you are required to pay any fines that come about from, whatever violation that is, and however that ends up being adjudicated. Just for context, and maybe you've discussed this, one of the cases specifically is that YouTube was algorithmically recommending ISIS content that it had also monetized, and so it was funding terrorism. And their, counterpoint was, we can't look at all this content, the scale's too big. Right? Which is to say that, well, it qualified to be monetized in our system, and until someone flags it, we don't know who's paying us and what we're paying for. And that idea of advertising and the way in which money flows through these systems, I would say beyond treating them as publishers, we should treat these companies for what they are, how they make their money. they're simply advertising systems. Sophia Noble writes about this in Algorithms of Oppression. They don't create and publish content unless you're part of like one of their partners programs. They don't pay people directly. They pay people to put ads around their content, right? And so if we were to treat these companies as advertising companies where, you know, well over 90% of their income comes from advertising, and we were to say, well, the customers of the platform are not the users then, they're actually the advertisers. We need to have KYC laws, know your customer laws, that ensure that they're not funding terrorist content, quote unquote, in their words, virtually by accident. I would love to get feedback on that argument about treating them as advertising companies, because I am not a legal scholar, and so I don't know what that means. I do know that advertisers are consistently pushing the idea that advertising is free speech, and so there are free speech concerns to be weighted. But I do think that know your customer laws and also consumer protections are a much better system for getting clarity and transparency out of these platforms, rather than hoping that they enforce their own systems or their own terms of service on people. Even if we had an agreement that they would employ their own terms of service in the protection of consumers and other users, that would be a huge gain. But unfortunately, we don't have that system yet.
Yeah, thank you, Joan. Thank you for that insight. Definitely a lot to consider for democracy. Okay, next I would like to welcome Joshua Darr, who is an associate professor of political communication in the Manship School of Mass Communication and Department of Political Science at Louisiana State University. His first book, Homestyle Opinion: How Local Newspapers Can Slow Polarization, is co-authored with Matthew Hitt and Joanna Dunaway, and was published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press. Thank you, Joshua.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I will say, Sam Sawyer stole my bit. I was also an undergrad here, had honors classes in this classroom, so it's really great to be back home at BC. I've been encouraged at this conference to hear the emphasis on local journalism. It's what I study, and I think, as the title of the book shows, I think it can be good for democracy. But I also want to, just today, explore some of the tension between two of the things we've heard about local journalism, one of which is that we need it, and the other is that it's not very good. That local journalism today, because of the massive staff cuts, because of the closures and consolidations,
Closer to you.
are...
Is it on? Turn it on.
Okay. Is it not on? Okay. Is that better?
No. Here, use mine. Oh, yeah, no. Is that better?
There we go. Give a little tap tap.
Yeah.
There you go.
Here,
Okay.
take this one. It works. I got lots of laughs.
Okay. I got them without it, but no. Is that better? Yes, it is. All right. So as the supply of local journalists has been depleted, it's exacerbated disparities in the local media environment that already existed. Right? There are, as we've heard, and as is often overlooked in this conversation, which can become a little bit utopian about how great local news is and how much it helps democracy. There are many communities within America for whom local news has always been in crisis because it has never supplied minority communities, under-resourced communities with the local news that wealthier white audiences that could pay for it were receiving. And so exploring this question of we need this for helping democracy, it's not very good at the moment, it's not very local at the moment, it's highly national due to the fact that wire stories are cheaper. As a social scientist, as a political scientist, I want to approach this from the perspective of what's the mechanism and how does this fit with our existing theories of political behavior? So what can we actually get out of local media that helps us do democracy better? And I get a little worried in some of these conversations that it comes across as journalists saying, hire more of me and democracy will be better. And whether or not that's true, it's not the most persuasive frame from which to approach the question. So I think that just a couple of possible suspects for this, I think look a little differently when you approach them from political behavior, just as a way to get into this discussion. Is it the observation of local government that makes local newspapers better? Is it a Hawthorne effect where people behave differently when they're being observed, and sunshine is the best disinfectant, in the words of Louis Brandeis? Or is this system hackable by politicians with no shame? That's kind of the mechanism of that, is that politicians will feel ashamed, or that they will lose votes because of reporting on the things they're doing poorly, which depends on kind of a broad-based readership for that information. And we've had a rise in politicians with no shame and a decrease in local newspaper readership. So I'm worried about the weakness of the potential mechanism of observation there. Is participation in democracy good? Does it make things more representative? Is it better if that participation is informed, right? Yes, I think local news helps us do that. At the same time, one of the major motivators for turning out to vote is party ID and negative polarization. So if you look at just high turnout, that's not necessarily a good thing from the perspective of political information. It can reflect the fact that the two sides really don't like each other, and they see that the stakes are very high. And so they have to turn out to vote, and they're going to vote for whoever has the letter next to their name that they like. So that could be a little bit different too. Identity, and this is where some of my work has been, local identity is maybe a more fruitful and more positive identity than partisan identity. Increasingly, other identities have been grouped under party ID. Through Lily Mason's work explains this probably the best. And our work argues that since local identity is not party ID, it's more cross-cutting. But you could make the argument that newspapers are building local identity through a lot of their non-political content, through high school sports and through lifestyle coverage. And they do that by supplying information that people need to check in the morning about traffic and weather. And it's not the kind of stuff that civically minded journalists want to produce. And so is civic-minded news going to help us build local identity to cut across party ID? The industry is in flux enough to make that an open question. And finally, in terms of knowledge, which is often the frame this is approached from journalists, this notion that we have to have informed votes or else all of America's politicians will be an army of George Santoses that are telling us, things that aren't true about themselves. David Simon, the creator of The Wire, said 12 years ago, this is going to be a golden age to be a corrupt politician because of the lack of local media. That's not really how a lot of this works either, from a political behavior perspective. The most informed people are not very persuadable. Adding information to them doesn't really add much from John Zoller's perspective. And people can get by with low information through the use of heuristics fairly well. And so adding a bunch more information for the sake of information is not necessarily the answer either. And so a lot of this stuff is in flux. A lot of this, I think it's important to not just advocate for an increase in local journalism, but to say what we need out of it. And moving away from a broad-based system of economically successful and broadly read local news sources actually allows us to disaggregate those a little bit and say, what are the attributes of this that are most consequential and most useful for making democracy better, while acknowledging some of the flaws within local media that treating it as a panacea does not let us do. So there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of investment going on in this right now. I've tried to steer my research in a more hopeful direction, away from newspaper closures. And I think that looking at one in particular allows us to get a view into this debate, which is a program that's growing in the Midwest called Documenters. That's what I'm going to focus on. It's about, it's run out of City Bureau in Chicago, but there's 5 or 6 different areas, including Cleveland, which I'll focus on today. Documenters is a program that uses philanthropic dollars to pay people from disadvantaged communities $16 an hour to go live tweet city council meetings. It's just go get the information and make it public, and let's see what happens. And if you have any initial hesitation about that, here's $16 an hour. So it gets at the information collection, and it taps into communities that have not traditionally participated or felt connected to local news, and it does so in a way that is public. So it addresses some of these issues about participation and information in an innovative way. And it helps people participate in the policy process, which helps them perhaps build trust in government because they know what it does and they've seen it work in that way. And the economic incentives are very different for that as well. So they're focusing on communities that are traditionally ignored or actively harmed, that have low media trust for good reason, in Cleveland. This includes communities that never were served well by the plain dealer and were very hurt by the Cleveland.com's coverage of the Tamir Rice shooting, for example. There's been a lot of ways that the local media has not served Cleveland well. But they've recruited 600 documenters to go tweet these meetings out and put them on a platform that's not necessarily owned by Elon Musk as well. There's all sorts of ways to get that out. So this philanthropic contribution has some potential, I think. It's not just parachuting a newsroom into a community and saying, look, now you have local news, be better. It's involving them in that process. And there's potential people that benefit: civic organizations, communities themselves, politicians, for getting the word out about the good things they're doing. There's reasons politicians should want local media to be strong as well. There always have been, and that's why government has traditionally subsidized and supported local news in many ways, right? So the question then is, what role for journalists is in this? Because I haven't talked about them with documenters yet, right? This is local information economies, but what can journalists add to this? Do journalists want to change their news values to meet a different supply and a different audience? This is not based on advertisers. This is not based on finding the audiences that will pay for it. It's based on what are the people that are going to city council meetings for the first time because they've been incentivized to do so, which, let's not criticize people for that. It takes a lot for anybody to get involved and go to a city council meeting. How can we take their concerns and turn those into news stories, and what's the benefit of turning those into news stories? What is the added value of journalism within this framework? Not that journalism has an inherent value that no matter where you parachute it into, everything will get better, but how can journalism add to the civic life of this community in a way that helps them take better advantage of a city council, a local media ecosystem that has not traditionally served them very well? Is this sustainable is, of course, the broader question. I am involved with studying Signal Cleveland and documenters there. I'm hoping to get in on the ground floor of Signal Akron, which is their next project. I want to really understand what it means to reorient a newsroom around a documenter's framework, because it's not as big of an investment by philanthropy. They're not paying a ton of salaries necessarily, and it's a very clear connection between that and civic information. So I'm just encouraging today to restate the question from communities that need journalism. News deserts implies so little information being around, and it's just wrong, right? There's ecosystems, as we've talked about with the jackrabbits and the sagebrush and from yesterday. There are, ecologies of deserts, and are we dropping in trees or are we finding water? How are we supporting these things? What can journalists add to the civic life of the community? Because there is now a newsroom on top of Cleveland documenters. It's called Signal Cleveland. It's supported by the American Journalism Project. And their question that I think they're trying to understand and deal with, as with their 15 new hires, is what can Signal Cleveland do that documenters can't? What is the contribution of journalists to this local information economy? So let's start advocating for the added value of local news, not the inherent value, because I think there's a lot of audiences that are going to be skeptical of that, for good reason. Use the crisis as an opportunity to save local news by repairing some of that historical damage and current damage, and reorienting around what communities actually need by talking to them and listening to what they actually need based on what their government is doing or not doing for them that they are experiencing within that government framework. So it's exciting because there's a clear role for philanthropy. It's also, there's a danger that philanthropists are fickle and they change their mind about what they want to support. They need to know that there's an impact. There need to be reliable, flexible metrics across local news areas that demonstrate that impact. And ultimately, I think they'd like this to get some government support, to Victor's point and to others about how government can support local news. That sort of depends on government seeing the value of being reported on, which, again, there can be. You want to credit claim. You want to take positions. These are very basic things that representatives do. But if you don't want people to know what you're doing, you're not going to like this very much. So I think it can encourage people to act better, but in the right context only. So just to wrap up, ultimately this is not an airdrop of local news into a community that's not going to trust it and that isn't familiar with that community. That is not necessarily a good idea in every case. It's a tool that clearly shows how it will improve people's daily lives based on how they can benefit from government policies. Just one example, Cleveland has a free paint program. If you agree to paint your house, they'll give you the paint because they want buildings to be painted. Documenters found out about it, reported on it, and then they sent a Signal Cleveland reporter to say, well, why don't anybody know about this? 97% of people that start the process don't finish it because it's a horribly bureaucratic mess to get through the system. So then they reported on it, and then once that's known, you can start figuring out how to get your free paint, and then Cleveland is better painted. And then, these things can move up the system. That's an example of how journalism might be able to help the tools that journalism has. So this is one possible path forward. I don't know where it's going. Signal Cleveland's a couple months old. Signal Akron doesn't have any employees yet. But I'm excited to find out, and I think that by posing that question of value added, I think we can reorient. We can use the crisis as an opportunity to reorient what we're getting out of local journalism.
Thank you, Joshua. I'm going to change up my follow-up question.
Okay.
And go with what happens when the philanthropic donors, when we scale this, have an agenda, and then how can we hedge against that agenda making and sort of the top-down management of the local news? Sure.
So this is always. Of course, the market distorts those things too. It's not just when one person with the money says what they can and can't do. I think as long as the focus is on getting information out, I think that there's one of the things that American Journalism Project is doing, I'll put this a different way, is involving community organizations, community foundations. So Cleveland had the first newspaper union in the country. It also had the first community foundation in the country, the Cleveland Foundation. And so they are trying to get local foundations whose express goal is to improve governance and civic life in those areas to help fund these programs. So it's not just like, here's national money, we'll never see you again. So local philanthropy has to be part of it, because otherwise it's not really local, and having a national funder that you're completely dependent on is going to skew your coverage, and it's going to skew it away from the kind of stuff you should be doing. So I like AJP's model due to some of that focus on partnerships and on providing slick website design and consulting. And local news websites are terrible. I think everybody knows this, but they don't have to be. And so they don't have to be illegible with pop-up video ads. And so that kind of service, I think, is useful. But I think you could have a situation where partisan interested funders look to get more information out there. There's a long history of partisan local news in this country. We may well decide, as Nikki Usher argues in her book, that partisan news at the local level is better than no news at all. I don't know. I don't know that's going to happen through philanthropy, however, because there's a decent amount of philanthropic interest in this space. The question is whether it scales and whether it's sustainable, and we're too early, I think, to know that.
Thank you. Okay. Next, I would like to introduce Caleb Gayle, who is an award-winning journalist who writes about race and identity and a professor at Northeastern University, a senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change, and a visiting scholar at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. He's the author of the book We Refuse to Forget, A True Story of Black Creek's American Identity and Power, and is working on a new project, Push Ahead, the story of Edward McCabe and his dream to colonize. Thank you, Caleb.
Hello, everyone. So one, my mic is working. Two, as I was telling Joshua's dad, so I'm the son and grandson and great grandson of preachers, which means that usually I kind of expect black preachers in black churches, and so as such, I kind of anticipate, or at least maybe inaccurately anticipate, folks to kind of engage with me as I talk. I understand that it might not necessarily be the case here, but if the Spirit so moves you to say amen or something of that nature, you feel free. But also because I grew up in, black church, I understand that things go long. So I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to keep this incredibly short. In part because Joshua's stuff, he had talked about on our presentation call, but it hadn't sunk in just how critical it is, in part because he named a few things that I kind of wanted to talk about, which is the seeming ubiquity of shameless, people who are willing to identify that the lack of the prowess of local news is an opportunity for those who want to hack without shame. And that's where I come from, right? So I grew up in Oklahoma. I write a good deal about the West. I write a good deal about kind of the ways in which history informs kind of our present conflicts, right? And the issue is that in my mind, the media ecosystem invites people to participate long before they leaf through a newspaper, if they leaf through a newspaper at all, be it local or national news. Oftentimes, the baselining of people's knowledge and information with which they can then come to the media ecosystem and call, are we allowed BS? Does that work here?
I think
I can use
speech. Free
yes,
speech.
so that enable people to call bullshit on what they see is atrophying as we speak, right? And so to some extent, when Joshua was talking about the role of journalists being additive, is actually enabling them to ensure that they see themselves as more than what we would normally think of as journalists, right? Who are trying to identify the hit story that's going to land on A1, that's going to excite people, maybe even incentivize them to engage in action. But if you can imagine a world in which someone at the plain dealer is conscious of the fact that, one, people are now more aware, or it's even more ubiquitously accessible to get information that's happening at their city council meetings, or why, for instance, there is such a messy bureaucratic pathway from wanting paint to getting your house painted and finished, that there's likely a story there that's far deeper and far meaningful as to why that bureaucratic process is so ugly. That's where I, as an acting, working journalist who writes for New York Times Magazine and other places, that's where I'm excited, right? I love to hear, right? I mean, now I need to know. I need to go to Cleveland tomorrow and figure out just why, right? It's so difficult, and where did that come from? So in my world, specifically within the case of Tulsa, Oklahoma, or for instance in the case of Milwaukee, we would wonder why a highway is built in a particular part of town that has separated so significantly this predominantly black community that had been so ravaged not just by the Tulsa Race Massacre, but also by the efforts of urban renewal, and then added to that the building of the highway, that quite frankly, we can actually do better jobs as journalists if we have a greater baseline of understanding. But what we're fighting against actively all of the time, especially in places like Oklahoma, especially in places like Texas, are these shameless individuals who are happy to hack our systems because they see that the Tulsa World and the Daily Oklahoman and other places like the Arkansas Democrat are atrophying in front of our eyes. And so what they do instead is ensure that because the media ecosystem invites us to be part of it before we even start, rifling through newspapers, but in part because we start in our classrooms, how about we atrophy the access or diminish the access that students and teachers have to learn about the histories that inform the present moment. And so a lot of what I focus on, a lot of the work that I engage in, is how do we, outside of these school systems where people are now obsessing over things like critical race theory, right, in a way that is so insidious and so brazen that it makes one confused every single day, at least me, how do we then equip these communities? How do we do kind of the extensive ongoing research with the history that walks among us through oral histories, through things that are similar to we have to now collaborate, because things that are similar to documenters, right, in other communities, how do we work actively with them to ensure that we can identify where parents and kids are going outside of the school system, because there is true threat. And as an example, I know that we're here in the rarefied space of Boston. We're in this wonderful palatial building. I just want to make it even clearer to you how bad it is, right? I know that we are wanting to be hopeful, but I'm here to give you the hellfire and brimstone sermon before we leave, right? So right now in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right now in different parts of the Southwest and the Sun Belt, right? Governors are actively trying to place schools into receivership and blaming it on different things, but all the while trying to extricate from the curriculum anything that might mention histories of those who have been marginalized, things that might give you an indication that perhaps it hasn't been all rosy here in this great country of ours, right? And so what we're then doing is bringing students into the space where there is significant rampant misinformation, only to be more susceptible to it in the first place, because we haven't equipped them with much of anything. And so then the presence and power and need of journalists has grown that much more to, yes, take that information that they see around them that seems as silly as a highway being built, or seems as silly as 53206, a zip code in Milwaukee, being designated as the most incarcerated zip code. We allow these sorts of small things to corrode any chance for those eventual people who will be engaging in our media ecosystem from truly being equipped to call the bullshit that we so desperately need. Does that make sense? I understand. I just want to make sure. Thank you. So I think to some extent, like, part of my excitement in all of this is trying to identify what are the useful ways in which we can end around these systems when people like Christopher Rufo and people like Kevin Stitt and people like Governor Abbott and DeSantis are so bent on taking advantage of the fact that our local news systems are atrophying at a pace that is, quite frankly, unsustainable. So I'm going to pause there, because otherwise I'm going to ask for someone to hop on an organ. We're going to have church. I'm going to pass around the tithe and offering plate. And this is a Catholic university, so it won't be too distant from my very Protestant Black traditions. But I just want to make it very clear how and why the increase in the pace at which we're trying to diminish any access to a baseline knowledge about how we got here and why we are here, the differences, the beautiful, complex differences between us, we're just making Joan's job that much harder, right? Does that make sense? We're fighting a battle on two very related yet different fronts that are just going to kind of get us trapped into a vicious cycle from which we can't easily escape. Was that hellfire and brimstone enough? Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Caleb, and thank you for bringing up Florida, which was part of my follow-up question. We actually spoke a little bit about this yesterday with Charmaine about New College.
Yeah.
And this question of media literacy is so crucial.
Yeah.
And so now your thoughts made me wonder, is there a way around these shameless individuals in a way that we can teach media literacy and arm students, regardless of the curriculum that's being stripped from their schools, in a way that, and if there is, what role does journalism have to play in that, in order to defend them against the bullshit that we see everywhere?
Yeah, so there's no silver bullet. So, and I have probably like 45 seconds to respond. So I will say two things. I think one, we as the kind of media elite, right, need to realize that most of us, even, let's take my very competent, incredibly smart, way more accomplished wife who's actively, working on people's faces. She's a surgeon as we speak, right? She is not particularly intrigued by the way in which we present news, right? I'm going to go a step even further from Joshua and not just say local news, but I think a lot of news sucks in the ways in which it's presented. And so I think people do love stories, period. And I think there's a way in which we can present stories that are intriguing, full stop, right? Beyond, I think, like, as the governor of our state right now in Oklahoma, I don't live in Oklahoma currently, but as he is actively calling for the largest school districts to stop teaching what they're teaching, to stop doing implicit bias training, right? There is a greater need, yes, of journalists to cover these kind of insipid actions of hatred towards different people groups, but it's also on our to-do list to then partner with various institutions, educational institutions, to figure out how can we present information that we ordinarily would expect children to be getting in a classroom to be provided in ways that are compelling and interesting, right? Like, I don't think our I don't think all of our creative juices have been exhausted yet, right? I think we can be that much more interesting, that much more innovative, and can embed it by identifying really useful Virgils to help carry these stories for us. So I think it's not. I think it's not just. I don't think we have to do anything too different from what we're doing. I think we have to just be better at it, more creative, more interesting, more intriguing, right? To leave you hanging on the edge of your seat as you're reading a story, or as you're immersing yourself in a story by people who are doing some innovative things in partnership with me on VR and AR, or ways in which people can access it by public installations, so on and so forth. So I think that there are myriad ways, and I think journalists who often have a tendency of wanting to say, oh, we're going to stand outside of the system and not participate actively, and it must realize we are actively part of the system, and we can engage in helping to better contextualize, better synthesize the world around us, and present it in ways that really call upon our storytelling techniques to really tell really just fascinating stories. And I don't think it takes a geek like me, right, someone who finds their joy in history or in how that history can inform the present, but I think that people generally like good stories, and I think we need to get back to just doing good friggin' stories. You see how I modulated and censored myself? But we need to get back to, I think, doing just that, and thinking about what are all the means, what are all the technologies that we can use to communicate in that much more compelling way.
Preach.
There you go. All right.
All right, thank you, Caleb. Okay, I'm going to introduce our last speaker, but not least. Charlie Sennott is a visiting scholar here at Boston College, teaching journalism and a provocative course called Truth, A Short History. He's also the founder and editor of the Ground Truth Project. He's an award-winning correspondent, best-selling author, and editor with 30 years' experience in international, national, and local journalism. Thank you, Charlie.
I'm going to go.
Thanks, Carol. I'm going to take the podium.
Go for it.
Good morning, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Is that on? Is it on? Can you hear me? Happy St. Patty's Day. You're right. You're right, Joan. And I did grow up here, so I can say that. I wanted to say, Caleb, you missed yesterday, but we had Charlene Hunter-Galt was here, and she also described herself as a PK, preacher's kid.
This is true.
And I want to say I'm coming straight at you as what I've just coined a TBN, taught by nuns. So that has its own set of rules and pain and humility. And I will try to emulate you in terms of the preaching skills, but I don't think I have anywhere near the energy you bring to talking about, let's just go do good freaking journalism. Like that, thank you. That is exactly what we need to do. This gathering has been incredible. I've been to way too many of these conferences about the crisis in news, but this is an extraordinary one for a lot of reasons. The power of the voices. Charlene Hunter-Galt yesterday was just mesmerizing. Jamel Bowie was riveting. So thank you, Jonathan. Thanks to the Cloud Center. Thanks to BC for convening this incredible gathering. But something deep has been missing. And the thing that I think is really missing from this conference is that people out there doing the work to try to save local journalism. There's a lot of big thinkers about it, but there's a lot of people who are out there in the fields toiling every day to try to do something about this. So I thought I would mix it up, and I'm going to try to talk about service. I'm going to try to inject a whole new notion. So not just journalism and democracy, but also journalism in service of democracy. And what my organization is all about is really a call to service. It's to say, we need you, particularly young people in this room. I have 2 students here who know that this is this is just what I love. I love to really think about calling young people, a new generation of journalists to serve. So I want to talk a little about my model. So I hope this will advance properly. Yes. So yeah, the class I teach is called Truth, A Short History. very much meant to be a laugh line because, of course, truth is not a short history. It's our human history. It is the history of all of us trying to find out how we can get at truths. And there are many truths, not just one. But I do think we need to go even deeper sometimes and talk about there is a crisis in truth. There's a crisis in how we understand the idea of truth. And I'm really interested in that. I call our organization Ground Truth. It's the Ground Truth Project. I founded it 10 years ago. And I called it Ground Truth for this reason. Ground truth is a very precise technical term. And it's a term I fell in love with. I learned about it first as an embedded journalist in Iraq and Afghanistan because I heard it all the time from military leaders would say, what is the ground truth from that area of operation? And then someone would step in and say what they saw on the ground. I thought, man, I love that shorthand, ground truth. But it was a general said to me one day, do you know that that's a very technical word? And I didn't know that, so I looked it up. So NASA coined this term. It's a calibration process where a person on the ground makes a measurement of the same thing a satellite is trying to measure at the same time the satellite is measuring it. In other words, satellites can't do anything without an accurate reading against which they calibrate the digital information they're gathering. So when you are looking on Google Earth or when you're checking barometric pressure or anything else that you can read from a satellite, if you don't have that calibration on the ground from a human being taking a reading against which all of the digital pixels are aligned, you don't know if it's accurate and you can't trust it. I think it's an incredible metaphor for what journalism is. We are a calibration. We are ground truth. We are the ones who have to be on the ground so that as we have social media, technology, we're bombarded with information through technology, but where are those of us on the ground actually calibrating it? And that's the definition of ground truth. Never thought of NASA as poetic, but I love this line. They said, when the technology and the ground truth or human reading are in conflict, trust the human reading. Journalism is about human readings. That's what we should be doing. All right, so I've had a lot of that ground truth, and I've been in these places. The truth right now is so deeply under attack on so many levels, it's hard to know where to begin. We've talked a lot about business models. We've talked about the ways in which truly journalism is under stress, and it is, but it's also physically under attack, for real. We know this. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but I don't want to avoid the idea that truth is actually under assault physically for journalists who are in the field all the time. Journalists are being killed at very high rates. We've had more attacks on journalists than we've had ever in our history. And this is something, sadly, I've learned really firsthand. I've lost a lot of colleagues. And I just don't want to miss a moment to sort of honor those who risk their lives every day doing journalism. One of the phrases I think we need to be pondering here is post-truth. We live in a post-truth era. I think most of you have heard the phrase. And I think it really is at the heart of this crisis around there's too much emotion and not enough facts. Local journalism's power is about getting the facts. We know we've been seeing this. This is just incredible. A lot of these downward sloping graphs chart my whole life in journalism. Like I'm among those who just have been on the slide. This photograph is a powerful illustration of what we mean by news deserts and ghosting news, and when a community that once has a great newspaper just see it collapse. So all those people have been let go. So we talk about somewhere between 50 and 60% of journalism jobs have been lost in the last 20 years. That's what it looks like in the Denver Post. Very human lives that are no longer doing the work they love and no longer doing that ground truth. Again, I really try this. I literally go into the business in 1984, and I just have been on that sled ride down. It has been a hell of a good ride, but I'm aware that it's really coming down. So the question for us is, we know why we should care. We had some excellent, I thought Victor's presentation on this was extraordinary. Really great framing, but voter participation declines, polarization increases, bond ratings drop. We know these themes, they've been discussed here. this is not just true here in the United States. Also, I loved some of the way these global themes got hit on with Turkey was discussed. But I think we could have gone even deeper here. Brazil, Hungary, India, Philippines, all of these countries are experiencing the same crisis we are in local news, and all of them are experiencing the same rise in disturbing trends like authoritarianism as a result. I think there's a direct link between the crisis in local journalism and the crisis in democracy, here in the United States and around the world. So this should be plural, the solutions. There are so many people working so hard on this, and I want to just share with you our model for a minute. And I'm going to just do sort of the best I can to go through it. And forgive me, I'm not trying to pitch our program, but it dawned on me that like a lot of people here are not aware of it somehow. And I think it's worthy. If anyone's getting bored, please just go like, don't do this. But the Ground Truth Project launched a program that we call Report for America 5 years ago. Report for America is inspired by Teach for America. It's picking up on the energy of national service and saying local reporting is a public good and it is a public service to go do it. Now, when you say to emerging journalists, come be a reporter, their eyes glaze. When you say, come serve local communities, they're engaged. That is something we who love this craft have to sort of get over, that cynicism that's been how we've shaped our being for so long, and get very idealistic about the work we do, that it really is at the heart of saving our democracy. And I get like, I feel like the hair stand up on the back of my neck when I start talking patriotically about journalism and democracy and how we're going to save democracy. But you know what? It is the fight of a lifetime right now. This is it. And so I find myself stripping away some of that caution that we bring and really reaching out to a new generation and saying, we need you. We want you to come. We want you to serve. And yes, you can be part of saving our democracy. So that's been hard for me to get to, but I'm getting there. The nuns have kept me so paralyzed in like that sort of humility. I don't know, Caleb, that I'm going to get there all the way, but I'm going to try to pick up on some of your energy around this. What we do is we have 300 reporters who are funded by us for up to 2 years. Those 300 reporters work in local newsrooms. We call them host newsrooms. And they're in 200 newsrooms in every corner of America. We're in all 50 states and Guam and Puerto Rico. This movement has just gotten momentum. And I think it's going to need a lot of people like really looking at it with us. Like, how can we be better? What are we missing? How do we get the word out? I'd ask all of you to let me know and let me know what you think. The model is based on a pretty simple idea, and I think it's why it's had some success, is that it's not hard to figure out. We put out applications to host newsrooms, and we say, what is a place, what is a part of your community that's not being covered, that you want to cover and haven't been able to? So again, this was something Victor talked about. We have to talk to the communities. What do they need? So that component is there. They then tell us what the beats are. We select the newsrooms, and then we have to make sure that they are both committed to public service and have good editing, because this next generation needs good editing. That's been hard for us. We've had to really work on that. Once we have chosen the newsrooms, we then say, we put out the applications for the reporters, and we say to these reporters, do you want to take on the adventure of going to a place that you might not be from and cover the news in that community and serve in that community? Or maybe it is your community and the news organization wants to hire you. We can help you get hired in your own community. We have a mix that way. But what it's brought together is a committed tribe of a new generation of journalists that see journalism, local journalism, as public service. And I just want you to know about it. I want you to troubleshoot this with me, and I want you to be part of the journey with us. The call to service is, we got featured on 60 Minutes, by the way. So the word is getting out, but we couldn't get the video to play, so that's okay. I just want you to see some of the faces, not only of Report for America, but of Report for the World. So 5 years ago, we launched Report for America. Last year, we launched Report for the World. So we are also trying to get reporters out. We're in India, Brazil, a total of 8 countries right now. We have about 40 reporters. We're looking to try to double that number this year. The need is extraordinary. We have so many more applicants than we can fund. Our funding model is we bring in national funding. So Joshua, to get at some of the things you were touching on around funding and sustainability, we do draw on national funders, MacArthur Foundation, Ford Foundation. Thank God for all of them. We have individual donors. We have very strict guidelines around how we make sure the funding doesn't influence the coverage. But we also challenge the newsrooms. We say, we'll pay half the salary of the reporter, and then we're going to help you raise half in your local community. So we try to teach them to fish, as we say. And that has been proven to be a really productive model. We've raised millions of dollars in local communities because we come in with a match. So we say to any community foundation, if you're interested in the environment or education or whatever you're interested in, you need to have your second favorite area of interest be journalism. Because if you are in there funding environmental concerns or looking at the issues that matter to your community around the environment, you have to have a reporter there looking at whether or not you're having any impact, or no one's going to know anything's going to work. So we're trying to inspire community foundations work with us. And it really has become something that has taken off. I'm excited about it. I'm happy to share it with you. And I just want to end on this little moment of this glimmer of hope. So we've talked a lot about local journalism is not doing a good job. I agree. I was a proud member of the Boston Globe staff here when it was more robust. It was bigger. It covered the world. It had a lot of things. But I got to say, the Boston Globe is still great. It is not as big a staff. The investigative reporting that the Spotlight team does is extraordinary. Okay, I'm very local, very biased. The sports page is the best in the country. And no, they really do extraordinary work. So I want to say there are those who are fighting in the trenches from the establishment media who are still doing great work. There are also, more excitingly, there are these incredible models emerging. You've heard of Texas Tribune. That's the most dramatic example of a new nonprofit news organization that is crushing it. They're really good at what they do. Their journalism is extraordinary, and they're hiring. But there are these smaller examples with these people who we work with every day that I'm so lucky to have a team that's working with them, and I get to know some of these newsrooms myself. Just a couple of examples. MLK 50 in Memphis. Amazing. The more locally here, you have the New Bedford Light. My son works there, so I am not objective, but I know it firsthand how incredibly powerful this news organization has been for a very distressed community here in Massachusetts, New Bedford. And the way they cover the fishing industry in their own community is really exciting. They're everywhere. Mountain State Spotlight in West Virginia. You've got, you mentioned Signal Cleveland. We work with them. We're also working with traditional newspapers like the Akron Beacon Journal. We work with public radio stations across the country. So we're a mix of traditional local newspapers, new digital startups, and public radio stations. It's about a third, a third, and a third. We have to all fight like hell right now in this moment to support each other in trying to do this and recognize there's so many people out there. So many of you here are academics, and I'd say you're steeped in this. Get at these conferences, be sure you're including the people who are out there doing the actual work in the field to try to change it. ProPublica, Marshall Project, Solutions Journalism Network. The list is huge. I'm going to try to stop right there. Kel, am I past the time limit of even what the nuns should allow? I think I am, so I'm going to stop and just say thank you. And I don't know if you have a question, Carol, if we have time.
I do actually have a question. I'm wondering, because between what you said and what Caleb said earlier, I'm wondering if this, and what we've actually heard at a lot of the panels, I'm wondering if you think that this model is sustainable and scalable, and that we should be thinking about these collective networks of new projects, or if we actually need to leave the local solutions to the locals and allow for, like, if it's going to stifle creativity by recreating these projects elsewhere, and won't allow for the kind of creative solutions that Caleb was calling for if we do that top-down model? Or, how is that going to grow?
Well, I think the creative solutions are solutions we're funding.
Right.
So like Signal Cleveland, New Bedford Light, MLK 50. These are really creative solutions coming out of the communities, and we are there supporting them. So I don't see how it would be stifling. I think it's more like saying, where is the excitement? Where's the creativity? Where's the energy? Let's go there.
Okay.
So I hope that's come through in our model. I do think a question around should we be supporting traditional news organizations like big old newspapers that haven't figured out the new models. That's a tough question, and I think the co-founder of Report for America with me, Steve Waldman, felt very strongly that there's too much atavistic wisdom. There's so many people served by those news organizations, even though they are struggling and even though they may not make it. Right now, in this moment, they're important. So there's a soft spot in our heart to say, if you're serving your community, maybe we can help you in this interim while we figure things out. The one I'm the most excited about, maybe it's because I started in public radio. Right out of college, I worked for a tiny public radio station like so many of our emerging journalists who work with us do. I love public radio. I think public radio is the model that we can emulate and that we want to support. And so, did that answer your question? Is it scalable? I think we're starting to prove that it is. I mean, our goal is 1,000 reporters. We're at 300. We have a long way to go. It's a tough fight. But we have an amazing team that is working really hard every day to bring it to scale. Very recently, I stepped aside as the CEO of Ground Truth. We have a new CEO who came to us from the Harvard Business School. His name's Rob Zeski. He's amazing. He was formerly our chief operating officer. He went to run the Social Enterprise Institute at Harvard Business School, and now he's back as our CEO, and we're really lucky to have him. He is all about scaling nonprofits. He's not a journalist. And what I'm encouraged by is it's going to take some really serious executive brain power and effort, which is very different than journalistic muscle, right? But real management skills to get us to scale up to the next level. And look him up. Rob Zeski is the new CEO, and I'm working really closely with him. I'm still editor-in-chief, sticking to journalism where I belong, and really do believe that we have a lot of room to grow and scale.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks.
I'm going to leave that
Thank
to
you.
the audience. I think we have about 15 minutes, maybe, for questions. If anyone has any questions, you've heard a lot from me already, so maybe we can have our... Any questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I just would like to know if the Ground Project has a kind of a report, and you have a comparison between the, I believe, 80 countries you are researching.
Thanks. The groundtruthproject.org has a website where the work of Report for America and Report for the World are featured. But we mostly are just a support for those news organizations in their own local context. So even when we work in foreign countries, we are supporting those news organizations in those countries, hiring reporters from that country to serve their communities. So the local idea goes across what we do, and it's 8 countries, not 80, but I love the way you're thinking it's 80, because I want to get there. So thank you. Did that answer? Thanks.
Just one request for clarification to Joan. So if I understood you correctly, you don't think there's a lot of mileage in models such as now in the EU, the Digital Services Act, or the German model of basically forcing people to do a certain kind of content moderation. We do need something deeper and more structural. Would that be a correct understanding?
Yeah. Totally. And I think what I just went to the UNESCO conference on Internet for Trust, and there's a range of needs by different countries. One of the major avenues that people are pursuing, particularly researchers, are calls for regulation that require platform companies to give data to researchers. I think this is not what we should be advocating for. I think actually that researchers need to be able to access data, that is true, but we should be advocating that these companies not collect so much data on individuals from the get-go, right? And this is one of the most important aspects of where the debates about privacy need to go, is the debates need to go towards looking at, well, what is the minimum viable product that is being delivered? So when you download an app, what data do they need to know about you in order to run that app? And then everything else should be protected knowledge for the consumer. So for instance, Gmail, when you register, maybe you don't remember this, but it asks you your gender. Does your email servicer need to know your gender? No. Why do they ask your gender? So that they can target you with ads. And so I think that there's some interesting ways in which folks in California are thinking about data privacy here in the US, but also the way in which the global conversation is being structured, that we need to reflect more on consumer protections and protections for the users, so that these, as Shoshana Zuboff talks about, this kind of surveillance capitalism doesn't become more and more and more prevalent and baked into the very structure of the web itself. And so I think things like the Digital Services Act, while there are going to be like many different outcomes, and it might even lead to a kind of Facebook for Europe and a different kind of Facebook for the US, it's hard for technology companies to build two things or replicas, but because the data market is so important to the actual functioning of these businesses, we are likely to see more invasive privacy loss in countries that don't think about regulating data markets.
Hi, so I'm going to ask a pretty self-interested question here, but as I've been listening to a lot of the conversation around local journalism and particularly business models, if you actually want a business model that's collapsed even harder than local journalism, it's the local Catholic press, which used to be funded by automatic distribution of diocesan newspapers in the back of parishes. It's utterly collapsed. These venerable institutions are shutting down across the country. And so one of the questions I have in thinking about local journalism, as editor-in-chief of a magazine that is not local, we're certainly national and global, but particular in a very specific way because of our confessional identity and our focus on Catholicism. Do you think there are any lessons from local journalism and the models considered there for the kind of niche journalism done either in religious traditions or in other sort of identity models where the connection, it's not global, it can't be journalism for everybody, but it's also not geographically particular?
Thanks, Sam. Great question. I think that the newsletters can be much more exciting, liberated, more digital, and they need to reach better audiences. And the websites are atrocious. And it's like anywhere you go, if you're trying to even find out what time the mass is, you can't. It's ridiculous. So I think there's a need, if that's going to happen, to step up. But I also think that religious organizations can serve communities in extremely important ways, and I'm interested in that. And I know it's a thing that Steve Waldman and I, as co-founders of Report for America, share a great interest in religion. And we've actually encouraged religious news organizations like the Jewish Forward and others to apply. We said, what you have to do is you have to make the case that you serve a local community and that you're gonna add a reporter who's gonna do something that needs to be done that isn't being done right now. And all the same standards, and you have to have good editors, and you have to show that you're about public service. but we're not opposed. And so I would say, like if these local diocesan newsletters and others can step up their game, why not jump in and draw on these resources available to try to help local journalism organizations?
This is probably a question for, I guess I'm going to call you Professor Gayle, because I'm a student. But you talked specifically about how sort of like established news networks like the Plain Dealer in Cleveland have sort of failed communities historically, and because of that they really struggle to interact with communities. And then you talked about how like the way we present news needs to change. And the question I have is, can those existing institutions which have been there and are historic but have failed historically, can they change and provide these new models for spreading information and reaching people? Or do we need to sort of eschew those institutions and work on entirely new forms of journalism?
Yeah, so great question. And maybe because my middle name is also Joshua, I think Joshua was the one who mentioned that the Cleveland Plain Dealer is as he described it. But I would say two things. I would say I can now switch, straining my throat. So essentially, like, I think two things. I think, yes, like historically, places like the Milwaukee Sentinel and the Tulsa World and the Tulsa Star have drastically failed various communities and kind of sown seeds of distrust that have bloomed even further, right? With the complete denial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator, right? Which was incentivizing people during the 1920s to go out and find this young black kid who hadn't been through any means of due process and to engage in the lynching of him. So like, yes, like those sorts of seeds are there, but I think it's a both and approach in that I think one, recognizing and reporting, even almost taking a media reporting angle to report on how they have covered historically these communities. I think one does like the right moral thing, but then I think it also incentivizes those who come from those communities that these established newspapers have harmed, right, identify some level of comity with them. But I think the ways in which they do that, the sort of channels that they use, the sort of kind of storytelling methods and methodologies, the way in which they augment and amplify those stories with various creative and technological means, I think then, yes, why not embrace those wholeheartedly while also having an honest accounting of what has and hasn't been done, and really tasking journalists there to do that, especially as media reporting within local news has also atrophied. Like, this is an opportunity for us to do them. So I think I don't think that we kill them off. And as someone who relies desperately on like defunct black newspapers or older or archives of some of these local newspapers to help give a picture for readers in books about what the time was like at that moment, I think like it's not just for the present moment that these things are important, but it's also for the purposes of history ongoing as people look back on this moment, right? Like, these sorts of newspapers are desperately critical. Otherwise, we might misremember our history that much more, and misremember some of the sentiments that existed at that time even more. So I think to Charlie's point earlier, like it's really not just for now, it's for your great grandchildren who will one day need to understand how this goes, or for a historian that has yet to realize that they're a historian retelling moments in Boston or wherever. It might be super useful to kind of reimagine the ways in which we transmit information about this current moment in various local environments.
I wanted to jump in quickly to let people know about an organization that we haven't talked about yet, which is the National Trust for Local News. So Elizabeth Hansen has been running this really cool program I saw her last week when I was in Texas, and they've bought at least 40 or more local newspapers and got them set up as local nonprofits, right? So that structure, that executive function that you were talking about, that piece of the puzzle is incredibly important, because if you can replicate these models, we're not talking about the kind of scale that says, oh, let's wrap everything into one centralized bureaucracy. The scale can be much more horizontal. We can see these roots growing in different places that have the legal know-how to be able to operate one of these businesses locally as a nonprofit. Of course, the question always is, well, what happens when the philanthropists move on and they're interested in climate change now, they're not interested in local news? Those are solvable problems. But Elizabeth was telling me that she thinks it's a $300 million problem to buy up all of the rest of the local newspapers and turn them into nonprofits. That's, half hour of Bezos work, right? I mean, and so there are ways in which I think we need to ask, things like the Society for Professional Journalists or ONA, which is the Online News Association, these associations to maybe come up with or participate in a kind of grand challenge like this. I'm not saying that the actual newspaper is the most important thing here, because I do think that people are moving into digital worlds. But imagine if Elizabeth's organization then was able to provide the cookie cutter cutout for an app that actually works, right? And that kind of sustainable IT that one would need to license or buy into, that then could be modularly administrated locally. And I think that that's one of the greatest promises of the web, was that it made everything local global, which really erased some of our localization. But it also made people who are local much more connected to one another. And I think that one of the things that scale gets in the way of, and this is hearkening back to some of Mary Gray's work that should be coming out soon about the banality of scale, is that we ask the question in the wrong way, in the sense that we think about, well, how do we roll them all up into this one centralized entity? But the promise of the web was actually decentralized, right? The idea that Facebook would exist as this platform that's everything for everyone is actually the antithesis of what the original dream of a decentralized information commons could look like. And when Facebook decided to monetize pages, that was Facebook's attempt to replace the web, right? And they didn't succeed. They got close. But now we need to imagine, well, how are these local organizations going to move into apps? How are they going to move into mobile? How are they going to be able to keep that technological infrastructure going? And I think Elizabeth is very forward thinking in this field. And it was my pleasure to work with her when she was at Shorenstein. And now I'm very excited for the National Trust for Local News that she's working on.
Can I just build on that a little bit, Joan? First of all, I don't get enough time to say thank you for the work, your extraordinary work and what you bring to the table every time. And I share your excitement about National Trust for Local News. I was on the phone with them last week. They are going to help us make a transition that I think has to happen, which is to transition to nonprofit. I think you can still have revenue. You can still have advertising revenue. You can still do events that bring in revenue. You can do everything you want, but I truly believe the commercial models have proven a failure, and that the nonprofit models have this idea of mission first. And it is that simple to me. And that's going to be how we move forward with, as Caleb put it, these we just got to get back to doing great journalism. And I think that is the fastest, best way there. There's so many others. LMA is another great organization. This is what I meant by, I want to make sure conferences like this have more voices from the people who are in the field doing it, because they're everywhere right now. And so many people are working so hard. And I think something that I would love to challenge a conference to do at some point is to say, is the next phase of saving journalism in America about mergers and acquisitions. What I mean is, we are all fighting in these different silos and working really hard to do the work that matters. And there's great areas and verticals of expertise. What would it look like if we actually combined forces and we started to really merge around the urgency of the mission requires us to find new ways to work together that's more productive. I actually think the donors would like it. Their dollars would go further, and it could help us answer that question of what happens when philanthropy runs out. Because if we get ahead of that and we think about places where we can really come together, I think we have a better shot at succeeding. I also just want to shout out to Rebuild Local News. Steve Waldman has taken an idea that we started at Ground Truth, which was to go after public funding, to really think about, like, you know, as several have spoken about this need for thinking through public funding as a part of the solution for saving local journalism. Steve Waldman has taken that idea, which he started with us, and he created a coalition called Rebuild Local News, and he's now gone off to really build that out and really start to advocate and lobby for that. So that's another one to watch. And we really think that this is a tipping point. I mean, the urgency of now, it is right now. Either we are going to get this figured out, or we're just going to continue to watch our country slide further and further into polarization, further and further into this apathy. So the favorite thing I've ever heard someone say to our journalists, our reporters, we call them core members, Report for America core members, actually was from Maria Hinojosa, who's the next speaker, and I don't want to get in any way of getting to her, because she has a very compelling message, and she called out to our local reporters around the country to consider themselves journalists of conscience.
Yeah.
And to start fighting like hell for what matters. And I just loved that phrase. I just wanted to give sort of a shout out. We've known each other a long time. This is a time for us to inspire, not just document a collapse, not just think through from an academic perspective. It's a time to really try to inspire and call people to serve.
Thank you. Well, on that very hopeful note, please join me in thanking our panelists.